Hello, Shirley Adams here to welcome you to our block party, Program 12 in the Sewing Connection Series 2. What kind of block am I talking about? Color blocking, because it's fun, it's fashionable, and it might be a functional solution to updating clothing, increasing their size, or covering up mishaps. Or for that ton of scraps you can't dispose of, think how they might work out into something wonderful to wear. Possibly color blocking is so popular because it's something attainable for everyone. There's no risk. Play with colors and shapes and sizes until you have something you like, then secure it in place. What can you lose? Here we have, for instance, down on the table, this little jacket. This is color blocked by the piece. One pattern piece was put on one fabric, another on another fabric, so that's a form of color blocking. And this makes it very easy if you're using up little scraps, and you can do that with children's clothes. Some patterns are already color blocked for you to suggest what you might do. So that's an idea. Then as far as playing with shapes, I have seen recently in Ready to Wear, and do look at Ready to Wear. It's a great place for ideas, whether it's in the catalogs or the magazines or in the stores. But I've seen a lot of things that I'm going to show you in a minute here recently, in that they have all these color blocks on a background, maybe a sweater or a t-shirt, but all affixed in some way to a background. So here are some of the ideas, just in shapes and sizes and colors. This first one gives it a little bit of an unequal division because it's always more interesting. If you have two sides divided equally, it doesn't have the impact that a little bit of off balance would do. So a couple of colors here that go nicely together. Here's an alternative to the same colors. Maybe break up that spacing in a different way, and maybe that's more interesting. But notice the black space all around it, because that's what gives it some impact. That background color is what we're looking at. So there's another thought. Those colors that clash so nicely, the reds and oranges and pinks and fuchsias and magentas and purples, all of those together might be just a whole lot of the little scraps that you have that you'd like to do something with. And they are so fashionable right now, used in combination of this sort. So all four of these blocks were the very same size. They're just arranged in different ways so that they kind of complement each other, clash, vibrate off each other a little bit. Here are the same ones arranged in a different way. Which way interests you more? That's up to you. You're the artist. You do as you please here. Here are the same colors, just broken up in different ways still, so that we have some stripes, both horizontal and vertical. And also you might do some playing around with these after they're affixed, pin them on the fabric or whatever, and then put them in front of your body, in front of a mirror, to see what they look like. Because also here we're creating some optical illusions that might make you look taller or shorter or wider or narrower. But see how that is on you. If you're doing a wall hanging, fine, you don't have to worry about it. But if you're going to put it on you, then you better see what kind of an illusion it produces. Or here's one just using multicolors. And with these multicolors, we could also do different illusions, and they are in different shapes, different sizes, besides being different colors. So it's a fun thing to do. You really can't go wrong. Anything you do on this turns out looking just terrific. And you'll see as you look through those catalogs that they have done very, very similar things. It isn't all that different than what you do. Well, after you have them all affixed in some way, pinned, whatever, what I have done with these, they're not coming off because I've fused them all in place with any of the fusibles on the market, and just with your iron then you can go ahead and fuse them. So that's what I've done with this. But still, even with the fusible, you may have to use something behind it as you stitch it on, because I'm not sure that these would go through the washer all that well. I think it might be a good idea to go ahead and do some stitching around the edges. Now these are all interlocks. They're cotton interlocks. They're t-shirt fabrics, so I would like to satin stitch this down before I put it through the washer. If you had this done on whatever it is, sweater or t-shirt or woven fabric for that matter, but if you would do this without fusing them down, then you definitely need to do some satin stitching. These are fused. Possibly you wouldn't need it. Also, possibly you wouldn't use the stabilizer that I'm going to use. And this stabilizer is so that I can satin stitch on this top fabric here without it rippling or doing any nasty things. Now sometimes you'll find you can do that just by fusing the pieces together because that stiffens them to the extent that it works out just fine. But just in case, I'm going to go ahead with this and put the stabilizer behind it. Now there are a whole lot of stabilizers that you can find. Usually they're found in the interfacing departments. You can perhaps even use a piece of typing paper or tissue or wax paper behind it, but use some sort of a stabilizer just because it's going to hold a little better. And with a couple of pins in place here, then just to hold the stabilizer in where I want it, I'll do some satin stitching here. And this satin stitching, I'll just push the buttons that will set it that way, and I'm also going to push the down button for the needle because when I turn that corner, I'm going to want the needle down so that things work out just right. The best thread to use I do not have in the machine because I am going to do some other sewing. The best thread to use though would be that nice shiny rayon thread. Now notice what's happening here. Notice how this fabric is kind of bubbling up in front, which I hadn't expected it to do. But since that's happening, it might be a good idea to loosen the pressure a little bit. And as I look at my little pictures here in the window, it says, yes, lessen the pressure, put it way down on 2, so remember that and you won't have the bubbling. Anytime you're going to be working with these fabrics that could scoot, what I am going to do right now is just jump on ahead so that I get past that bubble, and I'll just come closer to the corner to do some satin stitching over here. Okay, but with the needle positioned down, what that lets you do is when you come right to the corner, slow down so that you can see what you're doing. And when you're right at the edge of the corner, let that needle stay down on the outside so that you can lift the foot, turn the fabric, and stitch around the other side, and it'll work out beautifully, and you'll have just a real nice satin stitch there. So anyway, remember that you must sometimes adjust the pressure. I think a lot of people also get confused, if they're beginners especially, between what's the difference between the pressure and the tension. Tension has to do with the thread that goes through the needle, and you need that a certain tension. Pressure has to do with how hard the presser foot pushes down. So anyway, this is kind of a good idea to do this with a satin stitch, and of course it would take a while to get around all of this. And I'm not going to go around all of it because I want to show you some other alternatives to this. So here we have just a little bit of satin stitching around the edge, and I really did it with a kind of a clashy color there, but it doesn't look too bad. It's fun to put these colors together and you can do many things with them. So try your hand at it. As I said, what do you have to lose? Everything seems to work out just beautifully. Another alternative to using the satin stitching would be to use instead some bias covering the top of it. This pillow, for instance, has all those same pieces of fabric, or pieces of fabric anyway, similar pieces. It has the fabric put down here, and then they're covered, the edges, with bias tape instead of with the satin stitch. So here's another idea. If you're going to do this with the bias tape, then that uses also anything that's thin and soft, makes great bias that you can use, whether it's knit, woven, it doesn't matter. But the point is, bias. Do cut it on the bias. So here's how you cut bias. You always need to fold it. This is a straight cut piece of fabric here, and I'm going to fold this so that what used to be the lengthwise here is going to be over here parallel with the crosswise. And what results on this fold is 45-degree angle. That's true bias. So I'm going to cut this off right there at that angle, right at that fold. And then to make the bias tape, I'm going to use a little bias tape maker, which is a neat gadget you can get in any fabric shop, sewing machine shop. And I want to cut this twice the width of the bias tape maker. So it's about a 1/2 inch. I'm going to cut this about 1 inch. So I'll just cut this using a little seam gauge. And once I have this started, you can see by the way it moves around that it is very soft fabric, but it nicely makes bias that way. This is sort of a silky blouse. It's actually a lining fabric, I guess, that I have here, but it would do just fine for that bias. Okay, and then the way you do this on the ironing board is turn on the iron first of all, and but this needs to come through the little tape maker We'll put that sharpened end of the fabric in here, and probably because it's such soft fabric, I'm going to have to take a pin and help it through, and it'll come out the other end. There, it pops out the other end. And then I'm going to anchor this to the board, and as I move this little tape maker along, it just folds over the edges nicely. And I'll have the bias to put on the edge to cover it up with. Then you would just use this instead of the satin stitching to put over those raw edges and cover them that way. And with bias, of course, it curves very nicely, so it's an easy way to do it, and something you might be more interested in. It gets some more fabric in, some more variety, and a little bit more interest, perhaps. So another thing that it's kind of fun to try. I also like to do some of this on the serger, and here's a little color blocking with thread. I'm not going to rethread the serger to put it in, but you can see where I was just playing with this, and where I, with this thread, this variegated thread, did some color blocking. So this is another possibility. Color blocking's big. You see it everywhere imaginable, so time to try some. But what I'm going to do is make some fabric, and that fabric I'm just going to make on the serger. I have here a whole lot of little fabric scraps, so I will just start with these scraps. I'll put them down here in a stack and start sewing them together on the serger. And this is just a quick putting them through, making little seams. But this is great for all those pieces that you have that you don't quite know what to do with. And then we'll take another one and put it on the other side, and so on. You just keep building until you have what you want. Now what I've taken here is kind of related colors. I've used all blues and purples and blue-greens, but you can have them completely different. They don't have to be related in any way. Whatever is to your liking, since you are the designer. As I was recently looking through a little catalog that came, I imagine that I saw at least 10, in just one small catalog, at least 10 different things that were color blocked, which made me think, better do some of this. Time to see how much fun it is. Well, you can see I already have about 8 inches built here. Let's put another piece on or so. And what I'm trying to do is build enough fabric so that I can then put a pattern piece on it and be able to cut something out. Now you could, of course, if you preferred, cut apart your pattern first, but that seems a little silly. I really wouldn't want to cut apart the pattern in advance unless I had to. I think it's easier to just build the fabric and then do the fabric thing or the pattern afterwards. So one more piece here, and then I know I have plenty to make that little t-shirt front. Especially when you sew with interlocks, any of the long strips that you have left over from the project are really kind of useless. There isn't a whole lot you can do with them. Unless they are crosswise, but if they're lengthwise, what else are you going to do? So this is a perfect use for those. I'll just cut some of these off so that I can open it up, and when it is all opened up, then of course you'd have to press it again over on the iron. And after I have all this pressed, they can all go the same way or they can go different directions. But after I have this pressed, and notice how these are going different directions all by themselves. See how some of it's going this way, the other one's going the other way. The reason for this is because I don't have necessarily all the same thicknesses here. If the fabric is a little bit heavier, it's going to force the seam away from it, and I'm just going to let it do that. It's quite all right with me if it does. So each of these I would press just the way it wants to go rather than fighting it. And by now I have more than enough for that fabric piece that I want to cut. So With this down, I'd put my little pattern piece on top of it, and I'm ready to go. It's that easy. Just pin it down and cut it out, and everything will be super. So the only time that I would actually cut apart a pattern piece, because as you can see, this was so easy to do that why would you cut a pattern apart? The only time I would actually do that is if I had curvy lines. And then it is very difficult to put curvy lines together and have them come out into a flat piece of fabric. So instead of cutting it out like this, after I have built the fabric, if I had those curvy lines, and I'll show you an example of one, but you can see how everything's going to work out perfectly. If I had a shirt like this with the curvy lines in it, this would simply be too difficult to come out with a flat piece of fabric by using it. So this might be a place where you would build something different, and that something might be, oh, like this. One of those flexible curves, if you can't eyeball a curve easily in your pattern piece. And I wouldn't cut up a pattern for this, of course. I would instead use a duplicate. That's what I have here. I've traced a duplicate pattern. And with that, I would just arrange whatever kind of curve I want here and trace around the edge of it. And with that edge trace then, so here's one curve. It's going to look like this. And here's another curve that'll look this way. And it's amazing how artistic you can be with these little devices. So I'll put another one here. And then I'm going to cut all this pattern apart. Let me give one more here. Do it a different shape, sort of like this. But here again, you can create a lot of optical illusions that may or may not be good. So you better, after you have your lines drawn, you better look at that pattern in front of you, in front of the mirror, to see what it looks like on you. But then before I cut these pieces apart, I'm going to do something additionally. I'm going to number them so I won't have a jigsaw puzzle to put together later. So here's 1, here's 2. Is that a right side up 2? 3. I'm doing this upside down, you realize, so trying to figure out how it looks. What's 4? It's this way? Well, if it isn't, you'll realize I'm upside down. So I've numbered them so I know which way to go, but then additionally I'm going to do this. I'll put a little hash mark here and a little one here and here. And what these little hash marks are is after you cut this apart, you're going to, of course, add seam allowances every place, because you must have seams in order to sew it together again. And this can be done on the serger. So as I cut this apart, I would put it down on my fabric, my clear fabric that isn't all pieced together here, just all one color fabric. I'd put it down on a fabric, and as I cut this out, I would cut not right on the edge here, but I would give it an extra 1/4 inch out here, an extra 1/4 inch wider. And when I come to one of those little notches, I'd cut a notch, or else cut a little clip at least, so that later on then, after you have them all cut and you're ready to put them together, you can put them together by those little guide marks. That's what notches, clips are all about, so that you can easily reconstruct it after you're finished. So another little fun thing to do with color blocking. Now the t-shirt I'm wearing, I did a little experimenting first, because you don't know what's going to happen until you actually sit down and do it. And I had originally planned to do this t-shirt on the serger because it's so fast to do it that way. But I always experiment first. Every thing that you sew is a whole new ball game. You never know what's going to result. So this was my little sample scrap that I played with before I made this t-shirt. It only takes a few minutes to do this, and it saves an awful lot of grief by knowing what's going to happen before it ever happens, before you ever do it. So here I have done some serger. I have done some by machine, different stitches, straight stitch maybe. And with all these, I pressed them open, did whatever, and then I, on top of this, couch the yarn. This is a novelty yarn with big nubs in it, which can be a little difficult, but it just seemed it's something that needed to be done. I had this ball of yarn, and it was crying to have something done to it. So I took the various colors from that and put them together in this t-shirt, since I just happened to have all those colors in interlock. Okay, the reason I did use just straight stitch, just nothing unusual, the straight stitch, and I'll put it back down with some pressure here since I'm not going to do a satin stitch. The reason I did this is because that's what turned out the flattest. I found that they all worked out pretty well, but as far as couching the yarns on top of them, what worked out best was just a straight seam, and so this is how I ended up doing the t-shirt. Then after I had that straight seam in and had it pressed open, Then comes the couching, and I'm going to just put it over one of these seams that would not work quite as well, since that's the seams that I have available here. This one I did a slight zigzag, because if you need to have any stretch, sometimes you straight stitch a machine with zigzag so that you have a little bit of stretch. Not a great big satin stitch, but just a little narrow zigzag just to give you some stretch. So I'll just put that over here, and you have to decide about this time what foot's going to be the most the easiest one to use. Now this, I have a foot that has a little groove underneath, so that wouldn't be bad. But I tried it with this foot already, and I found that what I could do it still easier with, rather than this foot with the groove underneath to allow the yarn to go through, because this yarn has such big nubs in it, I found it easier still to do it with another foot that also has that groove, but what this foot also has is an open toe. There's nothing to hamper my vision in front, and so that made it still easier. So that's what I'm going to put on here, and I am going to then put this on not a satin stitch. I want a bigger zigzag. I'll put it maybe about here on this and see what happens. So as I put this together and do a little of that zigzag stitching. Now with couching, you might try also to see what type stitch does the best job on your machine, because maybe it's just a simple zigzag like this, and if I would actually do this, I'd probably make longer stitches. I'm going to lengthen them to here because I think these might look better still. Okay, see, these stitches are a little longer now, and they probably look a little better. There was no need for them to be so close. I might also want to make them wider or narrower, whatever. Another alternative would be trying not just a zigzag, but perhaps some other decorative stitch. This isn't a decorative stitch. It actually is a blind hem stitch. But you don't use stitches necessarily on that machine for the one purpose for which they are named. They have other purposes as well, so it's just a matter of trying them out. Now where the real challenge comes in, and here we have smaller stitches again, I'd have to lengthen them to something bigger so that they aren't so close. Where the challenge comes is when you come to these little flags that are flying, or when you come to the big nubs, and that's when you have to work around them, and you might have to pay close attention to what your machine is doing at that point. I don't have a nub here. I'll try to get a nub. Here's one. I'll try to work a nub up in here to see what kind of problem it gives us. I'll raise that foot so I can get it under. And the problem it's going to give us is that it won't go through most feet. See that big nubby thing here? So as I do that, I might have to exert a little pressure to help the machine go through, to help pull it through. So instead of just feeding it through, I am pulling it slightly so that it will actually cover that nub. And there are times when you might actually have to lift your presser foot and just move beyond, and that's okay. For this reason, it might be a good idea to zigzag or to couch it on, to attach it in some way with the same color thread, so that you won't have all that showing in case you do have to leave some spaces here and there. But something to try. It is a nice process. Something else that I saw just recently that fascinated me was an ultra suede jacket. And it was almost $1,000. And as I looked at that, I thought I could make that for this much money. Absolutely nothing, just out of my scraps, because this is what it looked like. They had all these pieces, and they went at different angles like this. Some of them were wider at one end and some narrower somewhere else, but they were harmonizing colors. Here I have all kind of natural looks. Even though this is a synthetic suede, it's sort of animal suede looks as far as the color goes. But I combined all these colors, something that is flattering on you that you would like to wear. And the way I combine these is maybe just to overlap them if you can do that easily, but then again it might be easier to do a little fusing before you do the stitching. If, for instance, I would just try to put this piece of suede over the top and stitch it, I have a feeling that what would happen is it might shift around a little bit as it's doing while I move my finger. Do you see how it's moving there? Well, it could do that quite easily also as I'm doing the stitching on machine. And generally speaking, when you would make any seams of this sort, in making garments, they'd be wide enough, they'd be overlapping enough that you wouldn't have to worry about it. But rather than wasting all that suede, I would like just a very slight overlap. So here would be a good place to use some sort of a fusible in between those layers. And if you're going to use a fusible and just want a little tiny bit of it, fold it all up. Instead of cutting one long string, fold it all up nice and straight so that all those layers are coinciding, and cut your little narrow strip through several layers at once like this, and it just goes a lot faster. And then what I would do is put this down on the one part of the suede, put the other down on top of it, and just barely overlap them about 1/4 of an inch. Put a press cloth on, certainly, before you press it, and then go ahead and press it, and then you can stitch it more easily. So it might be a good idea to do all that fusing first, and then do the stitching afterwards. Well, it doesn't take too big a stretch of the imagination to create some great color blocking. You'll have fun trying it, I'm sure. Moving into a different kind of stretch, next time we're going to look into types of stretch built into garments. Come join me and we'll stretch it out.